I haven't told this story to many people because it requires a listener to suspend their disbelief. When I've shared my story in the past, I usually get looked at like I suffer from some kind of mental condition or something. Nothing could be further from the truth. I know the ball from the bounce. You have to when you work in finances like me. I'll keep this short and to the point. Back in 2007, I used to live just outside of Salt Lake City, Utah, in a very laid-back but very populated suburb. I lived in a townhome that was about a 30-minute commute to my job in the city. I was on a salary, which meant that my hours would vary from week to week. I could come home as early as 12 o'clock in the afternoon or as late as 3 o'clock in the morning. It really depended on what was going on at Wall Street. I remember that this happened on Father's Day. After work that day, I decided to spend some time with my parents and have dinner with them. All went well, and I made it back to my place at around 9 p.m. As soon as you walked into my townhouse, directly in front of you was a staircase that led to a small hallway, with the master bedroom being the first door and the spare bedroom being right next to it. My usual routine was to grab a snack from the downstairs kitchen before heading upstairs. But since I had dinner that night, I decided that I would just go upstairs, take a shower, and get some sleep. The first thing I noticed was that the light switch at the bottom of the staircase was not working. I figured that the light bulb had shorted out and needed to be replaced. No big deal. However, as soon as I hung up my jacket and began to make my way up the stairs, a low hissing sound stopped me in my tracks. The sound was very disturbing. It sounded like a pissed-off lion. I immediately looked up. I still get an icy feeling in my stomach when I recall what was at the top of the staircase. During nights, the light from a nearby lamppost would come through the upstairs window and provided just enough light to see the door of the master bedroom from downstairs. The door was open, but that wasn't what made my skin crawl. On the ceiling just above the doorway was a dark figure. I'm going to tell you what it looked like to me, knowing full well that most of you won't believe me. Trust me, I've spent years trying to convince myself that I didn't see what I thought I saw, but the voice in the back of my mind keeps telling me, no, you saw it. You can try to deny it all you want to, but you know the truth. What I saw on the upstairs ceiling appeared to be a person on all fours in a quadruped position. From my vantage point, I couldn't make out many details, but one thing that made my stomach turn was when the figure moved its head and locks of long hair fell from its frame and dangled. The fear became overwhelming, and I let out an embarrassing yelp and staggered back. The figure then let out a guttural shriek and disappeared from my field of view. I heard a few thudding noises followed by the sound of a window smashing. I fled the house and retreated to my car, where I phoned the police. After 10 minutes of heavy breathing and looking side to side from the safety of my locked car, a police cruiser pulled into the driveway behind me. 2 officers approached my car, and I rolled down my window and explained the situation to them. The 2 officers entered my townhouse with guns drawn. After about 20 minutes, they re-emerged. They searched the entire house, and aside from a shattered window in the hallway, nothing appeared to be out of place. Of course, I went through the notions of giving my statement and filed a report, but nothing ever came of it. I told the officers that I saw someone at the top of my staircase in front of my bedroom door, which was true, but I left out the part that the person appeared to be crawling on the ceiling like they were possessed. I moved out of that place into a shitty apartment closer to my work about 2 weeks after that night. To this day, I fail to come up with any kind of rational explanation for what took place that night. I'm not exactly the kind of person who just makes things up for attention. I've gone down the rabbit hole of online communities, sharing their experiences with cryptids, aliens, and other unknown creatures that allegedly walk this earth. And even though I 100% stand by my story, I can honestly say that these people have way too much time on their hands. I don't want to end up like one of those obsessive people who go insane chasing a ghost. I've come to terms with the fact that I'll never truly know what I saw on my ceiling that night. I'll just put my story out there and let people take it for what it's worth. Thank you for listening. I grew up during the 1980s in a very tight-knit community in Georgia. When I was a kid, I used to love camping in my backyard. Almost every Friday night, me and my little brother Donnie would set up a tent in our backyard and spend the night playing with our G.I. Joes inside the tent. Our neighborhood was nice, but the surrounding area was a bit shady. You see, this was at the height of the crack cocaine epidemic, and within a few years our small town became infested by addicts and drug dealers. I remember there was an old man named Mr. Carl who was once a pilot in World War II. He used to live across the street from us. His wife died of cancer around 1984, and after that, he went off the deep end. 3 years after his wife's death, he became addicted to crack and began wandering the streets at night. It wasn't long after that when his house got repossessed by the bank, and Mr. Carl became homeless. Me and Donnie would see him almost every morning sleeping on a bench at our bus stop. Sometimes, he would be awake and would talk to us. We knew Mr. Carl, so we weren't afraid of him, and he never tried anything with us. He was always very friendly. After a while, Donnie and I noticed that Mr. Carl was no longer around. We asked our parents if they knew anything about what might have happened to him, but they didn't have a clue. I can't recall how much time went by since the disappearance of Mr. Carl, but I would say it was at least a month. So on one Friday night, me and my brother were in our backyard playing with these rubber band rifles our dad made for us. It was a piece of wood with a wooden clip glued to the top of it and a nail sticking out the front, so you could stretch a rubber band around the nail and clip it to the top. That way when you released the clip, the rubber band went flying. Me and Donnie were shooting up plastic toy soldiers when we heard something rustling in the bushes outside. Now, this is Georgia. We've chased away our fair share of raccoons and stray dogs. And with our new makeshift weapons, we were feeling extra brave that night. We decided not to go get our dad, and that we would handle the intruder ourselves. So we both exited the tent and made our way to the very back of the yard, where a chain-link fence separated our property from a small forest area. Donnie had brought along the flashlight and was pointing it into the forest just beyond the fence. When we got to the fence line, a figure emerged from behind a tree. I recognized the jacket that the person was wearing. It was a dark brown bomber-style jacket, and I saw that the person was also wearing one of those Army veteran caps. There's only one person I knew who wore a jacket like that, Mr. Carl. However, when I got a better look at the guy in the woods, it didn't really look like Mr. Carl. He was definitely wearing his clothing, but the man appeared to be way too young to be Mr. Carl. I couldn't get a good look at the man's face. He was looking down, so the bill of his cap concealed his features. That's when I noticed the dark red stains all over the man's jacket and jeans. Me and Donnie just stared at the man for about 30 seconds before asking him what he was doing back there. The man then reached down and grabbed a large axe that was lying at his feet. He then began coming towards the fence. Me and my brother dropped our wooden guns and took off back towards the house. As soon as I turned around, I felt something fly past my head. I looked to the side to see the axe flipping through the air. It crashed into the tent, causing it to collapse. The rest of that night is a blur to me. According to our dad, when me and Don burst into the house, we were absolutely hysterical. It took about an hour to get the full story out of us, and by that time, the mysterious man in Mr. Carl's jacket was gone. I just remember my parents talking to a police officer in the living room later that night. As far as I'm aware, there was never any follow-up, and I don't know if they ever caught the guy or retrieved the axe he threw into our backyard. This incident effectively put an end to our Friday night camping, and we never figured out what exactly happened to Mr. Carl. I'm 21 years old. This happened to me shortly after I turned 18 and graduated high school. My family moved to a new house in Texas. My mother claimed that it was so we could get a fresh start, but I knew the truth. She was ashamed of all the trouble that my sister Jocelyn had gotten into in our hometown. Weeks later, after we settled into the new house, Jocelyn disappeared. My mother received a phone call from my sister's parole officer. Apparently they found her in Atlanta. And to make a long story short, Jocelyn wasn't thrilled about the move. so she ran away to a friend's house. Unfortunately, I couldn't fly back to Georgia with my mom, and I had no choice but to stay in Texas. The next morning after my mom left, I went for a jog around the new neighborhood to familiarize myself. It was when I stopped to catch my breath and change playlists on my phone that I felt a cold feeling creep up my spine. It was the unmistakable sensation that you get when you're being watched. I looked around, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. But I knew that someone was watching me from somewhere close by. I decided to cut my walk short. As soon as I reached my house, I locked the doors and immediately ran upstairs to take a quick shower. While I was washing up, I heard a faint thud from downstairs. I quickly turned off the shower and listened. Another thud followed. I quickly threw on my clothes and ran downstairs to check things out, but there was nothing. The front and patio doors were locked, so I was left feeling a little confused. Trying my best to keep my composure, I was finally able to breathe when my mom called to check up on me. I didn't want my mom to be worried about me. She was already stressing out enough because of the situation with my sister, so I told her that I was fine and that I was going to order takeout and chill for the rest of the day. Later that night, around 10 p.m., I finished up my dinner while binge watching How to Get Away with Murder on Netflix and eventually fell asleep on the couch. I suddenly woke up a couple of hours later. It was around 1 a.m., and the room was freezing. The thermostat showed 42 degrees. That's when that dreadful feeling came back. I felt like a deer being eyeballed by an apex predator. Danger was close by. My stomach felt like I was doing somersaults. Something was very wrong, and that's when I noticed that my phone was missing. After a brief search on the couch, I couldn't find it. Annoyed, I decided to use a website called Text Now on my laptop. It's a free online service that I sometimes use to track my misplaced phone. Trembling, I typed in my number. Almost immediately, the ringtone abruptly stopped, and that's when I heard heavy breathing coming from the other end. I barely had enough time to respond when I heard a knocking on the glass of the patio doors. I grabbed an unscrewed bedpost from the closet before checking things out. When I looked out through the doors, my heart stopped. Holding my phone was a dark figure in a goat mask. Before I can make out any other details, the masked man slid my patio door open. At the speed of light, I burst through the front doors and headed for my neighbor's house across the street. There, I banged on the door until an older woman came to greet me. She immediately called the police after I explained everything to her. The cops arrived 10 minutes later, and after a thorough search of my house, they found no trace of the intruder. After that ordeal, there was no way I was staying in that house alone, so I asked the officers if I could accompany them to the station, to which they obliged. While I was at the station, one of the officers informed me that they had located my phone outside the house. However, since there were no fingerprints on it, added to the fact that I couldn't give a detailed description of the assailant, it was a dead end. There was one last unpleasant surprise when I unlocked my phone to call my mom. Upon seeing what was in my photo gallery, my blood ran cold. The officer saw that I was uneasy and asked me what was wrong. I handed him the phone. There was about 15 videos of me sleeping on the couch, each nearly 3 minutes long. The masked man that I saw had been inside my house and was watching me while I was sleeping. I felt so violated that I became nauseous and called my mom and told her everything. Hours later, she and my sister came straight from the airport to come get me. We didn't live in that house much longer after that. For the longest time, I couldn't stop thinking about what could have happened if I had woken up with that man standing over me. Perhaps I wouldn't be here to tell you this story. It took a while, but I finally came to terms with what happened. But I would be lying if I told you that this experience doesn't haunt me to this day. This story took place during my early childhood, so I'll share events that I can recall. It's mostly bits and pieces. There are some things I can remember in great detail, and some that I can only vaguely recall. so I'll do my best to try to piece things together without getting off track. I have 2 sisters. I'm the middle child. They also remember a good majority of this as well. This happened back in mid-2003. I was 5 years old back then. My 2 sisters were about 4 and 7, so my parents hired a babysitter. Her name was Julie. She had been friends with my mom in high school. She actually lived with us for a while. All I really remember about her was that she was very tall, skinny, and had dark blonde hair that was always tied up. We lived in an apartment complex at the time. It was a place called Oats Creek. So Julie babysat us while my parents worked. She even ended up dating one of my dad's co-workers, which brought a few jokes at my dad's job about him being a pimp. Basically, she became a family friend. Not long after that is when Julie started to change. She started getting very impatient and rude, and even straight up abusive to us, mostly targeting my sisters. My older sister once told me that she thinks that Julie possibly tried to kill her. Apparently, she did something to piss her off, and in response she grabbed a bottle with green liquid inside of it and tried to force her to drink it. She didn't know what this substance was, and she couldn't get into great detail about the incident itself. I guess her memory isn't as good as mine. Julie would get physically violent with us over the stupidest reasons, such as accidentally knocking something over or spilling a drink. We were just kids. Of course, she only did this when my parents were at work. They had no idea she was a fucking lunatic. That was until our family cat attacked her. Julie closed the door with my little sister's hand still in the doorway. It was an accident, or at least I think it was. This, of course, hurt my little sister, who started crying in pain. That's when our cat jumped onto Julie's leg and latched on with her back claws. She was biting and swatting at her, with her tail puffed out, hissing and everything. Basically, she snapped. My parents were a bit surprised, as our cat wouldn't even hurt a fly. It was around this time that they started to suspect that Julie was a bit of a whack job. She still continued to watch after us while my parents worked. This is where my memory gets a little hazy, as if my mind is trying to block something out. There was one occurrence that I still remember to this day, 18 years after the fact. In our room, my older sister had her own twin-sized bed. Me and my little sister shared a bunk bed on the other side of the room, and I slept on the top bunk. Anyway, one night, my little sister woke me up because she couldn't sleep. So she climbed up on the top bunk and we started talking quietly. After a while, she said, "Hey, watch this. I can hang off the edge without falling." However, she slipped and fell to the ground, and I started screaming and crying. That's when Julie storms into the room, yelling and cursing, and spanked my sister with one of my dad's belts. She then picks her up and throws her onto the bottom bunk, and screams for her to go back to sleep, and then storms out, slamming the door behind her. Julie was so enraged that she didn't even see me watching her. I was frozen, completely in shock. I didn't know what to do. I can only remember one time clearly where Julie physically struck me. As I said earlier, she mainly went after my 2 sisters. I can't remember the exact details, but I called her a bitch and she smacked me across the face. I don't remember why I did it, probably because she was yelling at us about something stupid, which was usual. She told my parents, and then my dad asked her, "Well, what did you do to set him off?" She then got pissy with him and said, "He was just a disrespectful little shit." Eventually, not long after that, Julie went away for good, moved on elsewhere. When she was finally gone, that's when me and my sisters came clean to my parents about everything. Julie struck us several times and yelled at us constantly. My parents can't really remember most of these events, as their memories aren't that great either. But I'm pretty sure they felt absolutely terrible for us, having to go through all this. We never saw or heard from Julie again. I don't know if my parents ever confronted her about anything, but they definitely cut her out of our lives for good. They never contacted the police as there wasn't really any proof of abuse. Everything was all hearsay. Neither of my parents ever caught her actually doing anything. I wish they would have. I'm not sure why my sisters or myself never said anything sooner, like when Julie wasn't around. I'm pretty sure she made threats to us if we did, and perhaps we can't remember. Years later, we found out that Julie had been arrested and served time in jail. Unfortunately, we never found out the exact reason why. Sometimes we all still talk about these events, and I know that I'll remember this for the rest of my life. So yeah, that's my abusive babysitter story. Julie, burn in hell. This happened during my junior year of college. For context, I'm a 22-year-old female. I was driving from my hometown in the Chicago suburbs to the University of Missouri, which is about a 6-hour drive. I made this drive about every 4 to 6 weeks to see my family and my long-distance boyfriend. There were 2 main ways to take to the town that my university was in. Stay on the interstate system throughout central Illinois and to St. Louis, or branch out on back roads after Springfield, Illinois, until picking the interstate back up about 30 minutes from my college. I usually took the back road simply because it kept me awake with the constant speed limit changes and the occasional towns that I would have to go through. But on this particular time, I took the interstate system all the way there because there was high potential for winter weather. So I was minding my own business, listening to one true crime podcast after another, when about an hour from my exit, traffic came to a standstill. Great, I thought. It was already way beyond dark at this point. It was also a Sunday night, and I just wanted to get home to catch a decent night's sleep before my Monday classes. After a while, emergency vehicles flew past the traffic on the shoulder, indicating that there must be some kind of accident up ahead. After what felt like forever, traffic slowly started crawling again, and eventually picked up pace as soon as we all passed the accident. That's when it started. I will admit that I do like to drive fast on the interstate, especially on this particular drive. What college kid doesn't? I was in the right lane with a decent amount of space between me and the car in front of me, and that's when I noticed someone right on my bumper. Seriously? I muttered out loud. Traffic was no longer super heavy, and the person could easily pass me in the left lane. Suddenly the car began flashing their brights at me and honking. I was extremely confused. I turned off my podcast and kept a close eye in my rearview mirror. The person continued to flash their lights, half blinding me in the darkness. "Asshole," I said, flooring it to the left lane. I maneuvered around a few cars, attempting to get away from whatever issue this person had. Except they followed my every move. Now, being a female in my early 20s, I began to feel sick to my stomach, and I listened to enough true crime and general horror stories to just be the right amount of paranoid. I had read on social media recently about girls from my school encountering sex traffickers in my town and along the interstate that runs through it. One of the town's papers had even ran a series of stories regarding multiple sex and human trafficking rings used around this interstate for capturing victims, because it basically runs the length of the entire country. I shook the disturbing thought out of my head and continued doing about 85 miles per hour in the right lane, unless I had to go around someone. The car continued to follow me, flashing its lights and barely letting themselves ever get more than a few cars behind. I finally took the exit to my university and looked back, and the car was still behind me. It seemed as though that this person was trying to get me to pull over. Is there something wrong with my car that I just can't see? I wondered silently. There was no way in hell I would be pulling over on the side of an interstate in the middle of a dark, rainy night. It's exactly how urban legends or teenage slasher movies start out. At this point, I had no idea what to do. Looking back, I really should have drove straight to the local police station, but I was too flustered and scared to even think straight. I tried to think back on the last hour or so of my drive. Had I cut anyone off? I don't think so. I don't think I did anything to make any drivers around me this pissed off. I'm a relatively good driver, and I tend to mind my own business on the road, not engaging in any road rage or anything stupid like that. So I stupidly began driving to my apartment. The car continued to follow, still flashing their lights every so often, but no longer honking. They continued to stay glued to my bumper, and that's when I started to panic. What if they followed me all the way home? The hell should I do? Call the police and send them on some wild goose chase to look for me in this car while I'm driving around town? As I approached another small exit off of a local highway onto a smaller street that ran past campus and toward my apartment, I had an idea. As I got closer to my exit, I did not get in the far right lane to turn off. At the very last second, I jerked the wheel and careened across the gravel shoulder so close to the grass that I barely missed driving off the road. As I gunned down the exit ramp, I glanced up at the overpass. The car had come to a screeching halt and was honking its horn manically. I broke down in tears for the rest of the way home, calling my boyfriend and explaining what had just happened. I never got a good enough look at the car to get a license plate number, or even really a good description of the vehicle, so I never reported the incident to the police. I have no idea what exactly was happening that night. My best guess is that whoever this person was, they saw me when traffic was stopped on the interstate, waiting for the emergency vehicles to clear the scene. It's very clear from the stickers that I have on my car, one being my university's name, and one that says Dog Mom, that it was likely that I was a college-aged female. All this person had to do was end up next to me to see that I was a female driving alone on the interstate in the middle of the night and have just the wrong intentions. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, roughly 30 miles outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My hometown was once famed for being the pottery capital of America. Unfortunately, due to changing times, the city's glory days are long gone. I was about 16 years old at the time and was attending the local high school. Also at the same time, there was a performing arts school that had opened nearby, and I was attending some of the weekend classes and made new friends with some of the students who attended the art school. One October, a group of us decided to get together. There was 5 of us total. The majority of the students who attended this school lived at least a half hour away from the school itself, so it was up to me to find something that we could all do, since I was the most familiar with the area. There is an Ohio State Park in my city, near the outskirts. This park has many famous tales surrounding it, from the death of a woman who was left at the altar, to the killing of Pretty Boy Floyd, who was an American gangster and bank robber. But it's most notoriously known for Gretchen's Lock, which is a dam system that was built around 1836. The lock system is named after the man who built it, who lost his daughter due to an illness at sea. His daughter was supposedly buried at the lock for many years, although her body has been removed. However, many say that her spirit still lingers in the area, searching for her mother. Regardless, it's October, and that seems like the perfect place to go. And this group was myself, Amanda, Beth, Sarah, and Abby, and we were all in Abby's car, a brand new Dodge Durango. We all packed into the vehicle and headed to the park. The park setting is down a very large hill, nestled against a creek, which is why the dam was needed over 100 years ago. There is a mill house, horse trails, walking paths, campsites, and many other picturesque features. That is, during the day. There's an ominous feel there at night, almost as if you're being watched. Granted, we were teenagers, and we weren't really there for the haunt as much as we were there to catch a buzz of some kind. Luckily for us, Amanda brought the good stuff. We were all excited to listen to music and get stoned in the dark, and just enjoy ourselves. We smoked and smoked and smoked. You could have cut through the fog in the SUV with a knife. We were listening to the latest Metro Station CD. Mind you, this was around 2010, 2011. The sounds of music and coughing filled the vehicle to the point that Abby opened the door to get a breath of fresh air. I sat in the middle between Amanda and Sarah, which meant Beth and Abby were in the front, who were best friends anyway. Sarah wasn't a big smoker, and she was starting to get paranoid. Mind you, for a good reason. It was pitch black outside, and there was little to no light produced by the single solitary streetlight located in the middle of the parking lot, about 100 feet away from where we were. Sarah kept mentioning that she heard leaves crunching from outside. We told her to never mind, and that it was just all in her head. After about 15 minutes of Sarah having a panic attack, she tried to calm herself down. We agreed to turn off the music and hear Sarah out. We were there, sitting in silence, except for the occasional flick of a lighter. What we heard next left all of us sitting up in our seats. We could hear Leaves breaking. There was a rustling noise, but it sounded like it was a good distance away. I told Sarah not to worry, and that it was probably just some animal. After about 5 minutes of us sitting in silence, I started telling the old story about the young girl who perished at sea. The girls made me stop, because they were getting a bit too freaked out. Abby said that she was too afraid to drive out of the park, and that she just needed to find a happy place so she could start navigating the dark roadways back to the main road. I was about to get up and go outside and light up a cigarette when Sarah sat up and put her hand on my leg. Her eyes were the size of 50-cent pieces. She leaned in and whispered to me, "I heard something right outside." I laughed it off quietly and told her that there was really nothing to worry about. What happened next, I will remember forever. Abby goes to start the car with no response. The engine didn't turn over, which freaked Abby out considering it was a brand new car. Sarah started to panic, making sure that her door was locked. Abby tried to start the car again. Nothing. Just the sound of failed ignition. At the third attempt, her SUV fired up, and you could hear the engine echoing through the surrounding hills. Abby turned on her headlights, and the blood-curdling screams that followed, I will never forget. All 4 girls, including myself, screamed at the top of our lungs. We were in shock at what was in front of us. Surrounding the entire vehicle were men and women, all dressed in black and wearing ski masks. They were holding dead cats and raccoons up by their tails. The animals were slit right down the middle. Abby threw the vehicle in reverse, not knowing what to do. As soon as the vehicle began to back up, the men and women standing around the vehicle started yelling and screaming and banging on the vehicle, smacking the windows and kicking the tires. It was as if we were in the middle of a riot. The banging and pounding stopped, and suddenly everything was silent again. But they all were still there. We could still see them. Abby slowly backed out of the parking spot. Some of the men and women removed their black masks and revealed their smug smiles. They all seemed to be eerily happy. Abby hauled ass, navigating through the twisting roads that led out of the park. When finally we were almost out, we stopped at a stop sign, and we all came out of our fear-induced comas and started talking about what we all had just witnessed, when suddenly 2 feet slammed on the hood of the SUV. In sheer panic, Abby slammed down on the accelerator, causing the man on the hood to slam into the windshield, completely shattering it. He then rolled off moments later. Traveling at what felt like the speed of light, we hauled ass out of the valley where the park's located, pulled into an upscale residential neighborhood, and I immediately got out of the SUV and lit a cigarette to calm my nerves. We all shared our thoughts about what happened. I was speechless, and I felt horrible for taking them there. Once I was dropped off, I never spoke to Abby or the rest of the girls again. I think they had some PTSD from the events of that night. I know that Abby told her father that she hit a deer that night in an attempt to explain the dent on the hood and the shattered windshield. I don't believe we'll ever get to the bottom of what happened, but further research shows that there was a lot of cult activity in that area around that time. What we experienced there ended up being much scarier than the ghost story I had planned to tell that night. After my parents divorced when I was 5, my dad and I moved to a town called Southbury in Connecticut. My dad worked at a Shell station, and once I was old enough to ride my bike on my own, I would visit him when he was working after school. One day during the summer, I rode over to visit my dad, and this lanky, weird-looking kid walked into the Shell station. I noticed him pocket one of the snacks off the shelf. I tugged on my dad's sleeve and pointed out the kid, and my dad went to confront him. When the stolen merchandise was found on him, he was asked to leave. He then stormed out of the store screaming profanities. We later discovered the kid was Adam Lanza, who went on to massacre all those people at Sandy Hook in 2012. Fast forward to December of 2007. I was staying at my mom's in Baltimore when I met her new boyfriend. My mom needed a babysitter on short notice because she and her boyfriend wanted to go on a date. She found a guy named Nick, who was a relative of a friend. Despite him being slightly weird, we got along just fine. We played Star Wars on PS2 and popped in some R-rated movies. I remember liking him and was willing to have him babysit me again. But before that happened, Nick went on to kill both of his parents and 2 younger brothers in February of 2008 before hiding the weapon and trying to cover up the murders. His full name is Nicholas Wagner Browning. Fast forward again to 2014. My stepdad was in the military, and he got transferred to a base in South Carolina. I was a moody teenager by then, and I didn't really care much for being around other people, and absolutely hated being trapped on a military base. I spent a lot of time online in chat rooms, and gave my personal information out pretty irresponsibly. One day I got an email message with a number to call. Stupidly, I called it, and the guy who answered said his name was Dylan. I started hanging out with him and a couple of his friends. That is until I realized that all of his friends were racists and were trying to recruit me into their neo-Nazi cult. I broke off communication with them. Dylan Roof went on to kill 9 people 1 year later at a church in Charlestown. I know all of these sound like impossible coincidences, but I swear all of these accounts are true. It makes me nervous whenever I meet new people, because I wonder if they'll become the nation's next mass murderer. I like to start off this story by saying that you're always better safe than sorry. I listen to horror stories all the time, but I never thought that I would be sharing my own. For privacy reasons, I will be changing the names in my story. My name is Jessica and I'm 15. I would like to think that I'm a very cautious person. I live in Ireland in a big suburban neighborhood. I usually like to go on walks almost every day. It's nice to go outside every once in a while during this pandemic. It started off like any typical day. I got up at around 8 a.m., went to get some coffee, did some workouts before school. Around this time, a snowstorm was approaching my country, so it was very cold outside, and it got dark around 5 p.m. After I got done with an exhausting day of school, I went down to go watch some TV in my living room. Shortly after, I got bored and decided to go on a walk. It was snowing outside, and it looked really nice for a walk. When I left my house, I didn't bring my dog with me. He can be quite annoying to walk at times, and I just wanted to enjoy myself. As I was walking down a long stretch of sidewalk, it was about 4:30 p.m. at this point, and it was starting to get dark. I'm the type of person who's very perceptive, and also paranoid. I think it's good to be a little paranoid sometimes, as it could possibly save you in certain situations. I look up to see this man walking past me. I've seen this man around my village before, and he's always given me the creeps. I always get this weird vibe whenever he's around. Other times when I've walked past him, he stares daggers at me with an unsettling grin on his face. I don't want to be too judgmental, but I think that he may have something wrong with him. So as he walks past me, I keep my head down to avoid eye contact, but I can see from the corner of my eye that he is staring at me. I keep walking, but I suddenly had an urge to turn around. As I did, I saw him just looking at me. It made me feel extremely uncomfortable. To describe this man, he is about 6 feet tall, looks to be in his mid-40s. His hair was in a tight man bun, and he always seemed to be wearing the same clothes, jeans and a flannel shirt with dirty shoes. My heart started beating fast, so I turned back around and continued walking. Over the next 10 minutes, I could feel him watching me, which meant that he was most likely following me as well. I turned around again to confirm my worst fears. There he was, still staring me down like some kind of creepy statue at a Halloween store. We made eye contact for about 5 seconds before I felt my fight-or-flight instinct kick in. My mind scrambled, trying to figure out what to do. He was only a few meters behind me and closing in. I came to a junction and waited for the light to give me the signal to cross the road. There weren't many streetlights on this road, which made me feel even more uncomfortable. While I was waiting there, I heard the man walking closer to me. I was hoping that he would just pass by me, but that wasn't the case. "Hey there." I turned around to face him and just gave him an awkward smile without saying a word. As I crossed the road, he kept close behind me. Hey there," he said again. I offered a quick response. Hi," I spoke in a strong voice, without sounding too eager to talk to him. I kept on my way, but he followed me and continued the conversation. I'm trying to get rid of phones in my house. I'm trying to sell them off. Would you be interested in buying one?" As soon as he said that, I knew that I was in danger. This man wasn't going to leave me alone, and I knew he was lying. I may be young, but I'm not that stupid. So I just said, "No thank you. You have a nice day." And I kept walking. He continued to follow closely behind. I was now thinking about how unfortunate it was that my phone was broken, and therefore I couldn't contact anyone for help. So I began to internally panic. I turned a corner, and I noticed that there were no people or cars. It was then that I decided to make a break for it. I didn't look back. I just counted down in my head. 3, 2, 1. Run! I soon realized that I had made the correct decision when I heard the pounding of footsteps close behind me. I knew I shouldn't have, but I looked behind me one last time as I ran. The lighting wasn't the best, but I could clearly see that he was holding a large kitchen knife in one hand. I was so scared that my heart was practically beating out of my chest. I felt sick, but I had to think fast. The man was gaining on me. We were running through my village at this point, and I could see some bystanders in the distance. That's when the unthinkable happened. I felt a cold object strike my back. After a few more steps, I could feel my blood make its way down my spine. That's not a figure of speech either. This lunatic had stabbed me. I staggered a bit, but I kept running even though I was badly injured and bleeding. Fortunately for me, there was a small police station just across the road from my neighborhood. Knowing that this was a life or death situation, I sped towards the police outpost. Once I got to the entryway, I looked back to see the man running in the opposite direction. I ran inside, completely hysterical. 2 police officers immediately came to my aid. One of them called an ambulance, while the other applied pressure to my wound. I frantically told them about the man and tried to explain what happened. The ambulance arrived and took me to the hospital. I was in shock and so overwhelmed by the whole situation. None of it felt real. Fortunately, the stab wound wasn't that deep, and I have since made a full recovery. I gave a detailed description of the man and mentioned that I had seen him around before. He must have fled somewhere far away, because to my knowledge, they never caught him. That was the very last time I ever took a walk by myself. I would like to remain anonymous for reasons that will become obvious. This happened about 5 years ago, when I was 16. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I was an asshole back then. Me and my friends were a bunch of idiots who robbed, sold dope, and partied like rock stars. The area that we were in shall remain nameless, but I will say it was in Canada. One day I went to this guy's house. Let's just say he was a friend of a friend. He wanted to buy some electronics off me that I had recently come into possession of. We'll call this guy Mike. Now Mike was this fat white dude, I would say in his late 30s, sleeved up on both arms, with the words "fuck you" on his fingers. I knew all about Mike because of his reputation. He was constantly in and out of prisons for various reasons, mostly drug-related and assault charges. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. Why the hell would I be associating with a dangerous guy like this? The answer is about what you would expect. I was just a young, stupid kid. I went into his house with a friend because I needed help loading the stuff inside, and I also needed to show him that everything was working properly. Mike asked, How much? I gave him a price. I can't recall the exact amount I was asking for, but he obviously didn't like what he heard. I'm not paying that much, kid. 400 is the best you're gonna do. We argued back and forth for a little while, until my friend chimed in. Hey, fat ass. Quit fucking us around and give us our money, or you can go fuck yourself. Mike then grabbed a chrome handgun out of the cushion of his couch and pointed it at us. He cocked the hammer back and shouted, Okay then, get the fuck out of my house, you little bastards. We left and took the merchandise with us. We drove off laughing about the whole thing. Inside I was losing my cool because I had just had a gun in my face. After we hid the merchandise, I headed home. Later that night, I went to a house party with my girlfriend and spent some time drinking and smoking weed until my girlfriend wanted me to take her home. We were both pretty intoxicated when we started walking back to her place. Along the way, we had to stop so she could take her shoes off. That's when I heard from behind me, "Surprise!" Then a loud bang. I grabbed my girlfriend and ducked down behind a car as more shots rang out. That's when I realized that my girlfriend had been shot in the chest. She was still alive, but was going into shock. I put my hand over her wound and kept telling her that it was going to be alright. The shooter made his way around the car, and that's when I saw that it was Mike. There was a second gunman with a sawed-off shotgun with a bandana around his face directly behind him. Mike ripped my girlfriend away from me and pointed the gun at my face. I begged and pleaded with him. "Mike, dude, she's got nothing to do with this. Let her go." "Damn shame, kid. She's cute." He aimed his gun at her head, and anger completely overtook me. I charged at him screaming, "I'm gonna fucking kill you!" But before I could do anything, I was hit in the back of the head by the man with the shotgun. And Mike turned his gun on me and said, "Your turn." By a stroke of luck, a few of my friends came out of nowhere and began shooting at them. I stayed down, and when the shooting stopped, they were gone. The next few hours are a blur to me. I vaguely remember talking to the cops and somebody telling my girlfriend's family what happened. I can only imagine how crushing it must have been for them. I was eventually released, and as soon as I got back home, I took a nosedive straight into a bottle of whiskey until I passed out. A few days later, the police caught up with Mike and his asshole friend. After that whole ordeal, it made me start reevaluating my life. I'm a much different person today, and it's a good thing too, because most of the people I knew back then are either dead or in prison. My name is Jackson Caballero. I'm a 15-year-old sophomore currently living in Texas. Some backstory. I live in a house with my mom, dad, my younger brother, and my mini Australian Shepherd. My neighborhood is a safe place, which makes the events of this story even more unsettling. I was the only one awake in my house at the time. It was a Monday morning, and I had begun my usual morning routine of making breakfast and watching YouTube videos. As I sat down, I realized that I had left my headphones upstairs, and I would have to go and get them. For some reason, I've always had this irrational fear of the second floor of my house. I don't know why. I just do. So I was a bit apprehensive about going upstairs and grabbing my headphones. As I walked up to the second floor, I heard a noise coming from the stairs. I stopped and listened. When I didn't hear anything else, I thought to myself, "This is ridiculous. There's nothing up there." So I walked up the stairs and grabbed my headphones off the table. When I turned around, out of the corner of my eye, I saw the bathroom door move. It was as if someone had been looking at me and quickly tried to duck behind the door. I froze mid-step and turned towards the door. All the lights were still off, and I didn't want to alert whoever was in the bathroom. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw a stranger looking at me through the crack in the door. I nearly lost it, and I ran down the stairs as quickly as possible, and immediately called the police. The operator said to stay on the line in case something happened. I then heard a loud thud from outside, and it made me look out the window. Whoever was in the house had jumped out of a second-story window and was now limping towards the gate. The guy didn't get very far. 2 police cars pulled into the driveway and stopped the man. The whole commotion woke my family, and I had to explain to them and the police officers what happened. The intruder was arrested and ended up getting a 15-year prison sentence for breaking and entering.
There's always a reason to be afraid.
So, full disclosure, this story is true, but you're probably not going to believe a word of it. You'll most likely dismiss it as a complete fabrication and go on with your life. Honestly, I wouldn't believe it myself if I hadn't experienced it firsthand. And there isn't much I can do to convince anyone that this is not something out of a Stephen King novel. Ironically enough, this incident is what got me into reading Stephen King's books. I've followed this channel for quite some time, and you seem to be a tad more accepting of these kind of bizarre stories than most other horror narration channels. There seems to be a trend with these unbelievable experiences. They always seem to happen when you're alone and almost always at night, and these are the exact circumstances of my unbelievable experience. By the way, I am a journalist for a large publication, and writing is what I do for a living. So I apologize if this comes off like a fictional creepypasta as opposed to a genuine experience. I'll try to remain as grounded and concise as I possibly can. Remember, kids, anything that you hear online you have to take with a grain of salt. I don't expect you to believe my story, but I will ask that you keep an open mind. So, it was the fall of 2006 in my hometown of Austin, Texas. I was a senior in high school back then. I found myself in the unfortunate position of having to walk to and from school every day because the transmission on my Chevy Malibu went bad, and I was saving up to buy a new car before I started college, which was roughly a year away. One morning, during homeroom, the entire school was called into the gymnasium for an important announcement. Once everyone was settled down, our principal, Mr. Keller, approached the podium and gave some rather unpleasant news over the screechy, outdated PA system. He informed us that one of our classmates, a young freshman named Stephanie, had died in a hit and run the day before. I vaguely remember hearing something about it on the radio, but I didn't know all the details until then. This was a tragedy, but also alarming. I didn't know the girl personally, but I couldn't help but thinking that if some unhinged madman was riding around town looking for high schoolers to run over, I was at risk of being a potential target. I was one of the only seniors to walk home when school let out. I couldn't ask any of my friends for a ride because most of them either took the bus home or had jobs they had to be at after school, and I refused to ride the bus for reasons that I'd rather not get into because I don't want to get sidetracked. Let's just say that my school had a good amount of assholes in attendance. My place was about a 20-minute walk from the campus. Not too bad, but the route I took led me down some rather obscured back roads that someone could easily disappear on. But I brushed off the notion that someone had deliberately killed the girl. I mean, Austin did have its fair share of drunk drivers, and it was also possible that it was just an irresponsible driver looking at a cell phone. I felt horrible about what happened to that poor girl, and I hoped the police could apprehend whoever took her life away at such a young age. 1 week later, the school held a memorial for Stephanie, and the police continued their investigation, but the community had pretty much moved on. It was a Friday. Me and a friend of mine, Mike, decided to ride over to his house after school and get his older brother, Roger, to buy us some alcohol. We all sat on the back porch and shot the shit for a while and played some darts. Before I knew it, it was midnight. I had some work-related stuff to do the next day, and I didn't really want to crash at Mike's place because it would just be more convenient for me to go home. Mike was passed out on the back porch, and I told his brother that my dad was coming to pick me up, which was a lie. I didn't want to inconvenience Roger by asking him to give me a ride home, and to be honest, I don't think he was in any condition to drive anywhere. I had been drinking myself, but I certainly wasn't drunk. My house is only about a 15-minute walk from Mike's place, so I drew a mustache on Mike's face with a black marker and said my goodbyes to Roger, and set off on foot. I eventually got to a dark, narrow back street that connected my neighborhood to Mike's. This stretch of road went on for about a half mile, but once you got to the end, my house was just around the corner. This road was almost completely dark at night. There were some dimly lit, old-fashioned lampposts that lined the sidewalk, but most of them didn't even work, and the ones that did provided very little light. This was a road I usually didn't take on my walks home from school, and I rarely ever walked the streets of Austin in the dead of night. So under the circumstances, I was feeling a bit on edge. I got about halfway down the road when suddenly, all the lampposts went out at once. Fucking great, I muttered to myself as a sense of unease in me began to grow. I stood still for about 5 minutes to allow my eyes to adjust to the darkness. There must have been a new moon out that night, because I don't recall any natural moonlight in the sky. However, after I eventually continued to make my way down the dark road, the tree formation to my right opened up, and there were some floodlights in the far distance that did brighten up things to where I could see where I was going again. After another minute or two, I heard something that made my blood literally turn to ice. It was the sound of a car engine roaring to life, followed by a loud rattling noise. It's the kind of sound that's commonplace at vintage car shows, but when you're alone on a dark, isolated road in the middle of the night, that sound is terrifying. I instantly remembered what happened to Stephanie a week prior, and I began to scan my surroundings, looking for whatever was producing that noise. I didn't even consider that I might have been overreacting. There were no headlights in sight, and the sound was coming from somewhere very close by, meaning that whoever started up the car was likely on the same road that I was on. I heard the engine rev up as if to confirm my worst fears. The sound of an engine revving when the driver is trying to antagonize you is distinctly different from when they're just showing off. The sound is always sharper and more animalistic. I had reached a section of the road where the distant floodlights were blocked out by a large stone wall that led to the entrance of my neighborhood. The road also curved, which meant there was nothing but an empty black void ahead of me, and I was reasonably sure that the rattling noise was coming from there. I dreaded the idea of having to walk towards the sound to get back to my house, so I decided that my best option was to just wait and see what would happen. The rational part of my mind was trying to convince me that this was some kind of prank, but the danger emanating from the darkness in front of me said otherwise. I slowly walked over to the opposite side of the road, towards the lamppost. As soon as I got to the other side, the engine suddenly stopped. As I stared into the dark, my heart began to beat faster. I could sense that some shit was about to go down. Suddenly I was blinded by a pair of headlights. The phantom car shot out of the darkness ahead of me and came charging towards me like a heat-seeking missile. The blinding light and the engine noise had stunned me, and I only had seconds to act before the car rammed into me with the force of a freight train. I quickly leapt back towards the open road, just missing the car's metal frame by inches. I collapsed hard on the concrete as the sound of tires screeching rang out. I quickly stood up and turned around to see if the car was going to make another charge at me. But when I got to my feet, I saw nothing. I was looking at an empty street. There was nothing. The lampposts that had left me in the near dark were now back on. Well, at least some of them were. I was awestruck. What the fuck just happened? There was no way a car that had just missed me by mere inches could vanish into thin air without so much as a fading headlight. In the moments that followed, I wasn't quite sure what to do with myself. After the panic and shock subsided, I decided the best course of action was to haul ass back to my house. I went through all the possibilities. Perhaps I drank more than I thought, and I was almost hit by a passing car. But that doesn't hold up because I've been completely shit-faced before, and I was well above my limit that night. The car's engine revving up in the dark was enough to chase away any buzz I was feeling at that moment. I remember the headlights rushing towards me and seeing my life flash before my eyes right before jumping out of the way. This thing sounded like someone put a lot of work into the engine to make it sound like a monster. I only caught a quick glimpse of what was behind the headlights. I'm certain that it was one of those classic muscle cars you see at shows, maybe a GTO or possibly an old Camaro. But what still baffles me is that it seemed to disappear as soon as I jumped out of its way. I hit the ground, heard the tires screeching, then quickly got up. I kept what happened to myself. What was I going to tell everyone? That I was almost flattened by a ghost car? To this day, I'm still not sure what to make of this. I sometimes entertain the possibility that it was some kind of freakish nightmare, but I know that's bullshit. It's worth noting that the local police never found the car that hit Stephanie, and her death remains unsolved. Let me give you some background before I begin my story. This took place in the summer of 2014. I'm a female who was 22, turning 23 that fall. I don't want to share my location, so I'll be making some minor changes for privacy reasons. I live in a small college town. I've lived there my whole life, and I've graduated from there. There's a lot of history in this little town, but unfortunately we do have a drug problem here. Other than that, we don't get a whole lot of crazy around our small town. I worked at a gas station that was owned by a family member. My husband and I worked opposite shifts. I was the early bird, so I would work the morning shift. I would get up around 3:30, 4 o'clock, and open the store by 5. I was never worried about walking out to my car in the dark because I grew up living in the countryside outside of town. I loved being outside, even when it was dark. I used to lie in the grass and look up at the stars. When my friends would come over, we would always play Ghost in the Graveyard at night and did your typical teenager stuff during dark hours. Just messing around and having a little fun. We owned about 4 acres of land, and no one ever bothered us, so I was used to being outside in the dark with no fear at all, which I'm not too fond of because I was so used to being in an open space, and I was never really a city girl, even to this day. Now that you've got some background, let's get into the story. Now this is going to be a 2-part story, so bear with me, because both of these incidents occurred very close to each other. As I mentioned before, it was the summer of 2014. I was getting ready for work like I usually did. When I got into my car, I started pulling out of my apartment's driveway. I then noticed a man walking down the road, pulling a suitcase behind him. As I got closer, I began to wonder why someone would be walking down the street pulling a suitcase at 4:40 in the morning. I thought about pulling up next to him and rolling down my window to ask him if he needed me to call the police or something, but I was suspicious. I grew up being told not to talk to strangers or to pick up hitchhikers, so there was no way that I was going to let a stranger into my car. But I'm also a nice person, and I'm always willing to help in any way that I can, but I wouldn't do something that could put my life in danger. When I pulled out of the driveway, the man then started walking right towards my vehicle. I remembered losing my nerve and took off down the street. I looked into my rearview mirror to see him just standing there watching me. I knew something was off about this person, and I was also thankful that I didn't offer to help him. Some of you might think, oh, you're just over-exaggerating, but come on. Why would this man come right at my vehicle? And what the hell was he doing walking with a suitcase in the middle of the street at 4 o'clock in the morning? Once I reached my work, I called the police and reported it. I told them that I was just a concerned citizen, and I have been living in this neighborhood for the past 4 years, and I had never seen this man before. The police told me that they would send a car out to patrol the area. Hours went by, and I didn't hear anything from them. So I decided to call them back and inquire if they found anything. They told me that there was no trace of the man. So I just brushed it off and went about my day. I later mentioned it to my husband after my shift, and he told me that it was probably someone returning home from the airport or something. But the nearest airport is about an hour's drive away. My husband thought I was just overreacting about the whole thing. A few weeks later, I was talking to one of my customers and brought up this incident. It's a small town and everyone talks to everyone around here. As soon as I mentioned the man with the suitcase, my customer looked like he crapped his pants. He then started telling me that the police had recently discovered bodies and suitcases in our county. All the hairs on the back of my neck stood straight up, and my heart began to pound out of my chest. My customer asked me if I remembered what he looked like, but I didn't really get a good look at him. I'm not 100% sure if the man that I saw was the suitcase killer, but regardless, I'm glad I didn't stop to help that man. A couple of months later, I was again getting ready for work. I headed out of the back door of my apartment. My husband and I lived at the end of the hallway, so I figured I would just park my car close to the back door because I thought it would be easier than going all the way down the hallway. Plus, a lot of the front parking spots are always taken. When you go out of the back door, there are these huge pine trees lining a cement pathway that guides you to the back parking lot. It was still dark out, and the moment that I opened the back door, straight ahead was the dark figure of a large man running straight towards me. I didn't hesitate and I slammed the door shut and rushed back into my apartment. My heart was pounding violently inside my chest. I was in full-on flight mode. I had never run so fast in my life. The moment that I reached the bedroom, my husband literally sat straight up and asked me if I was alright. After I explained to him what was going on, he stood up from the bed and headed to our door to look through the peephole to see if there was anyone in the hallway. He saw nothing, so he opened the door a crack and started looking around, but there was no one there. I was still shaking, even when my husband walked me out to my car. I'm lucky to have such a great guy for a husband. Later that day, when my husband arrived at the gas station for his shift, he told me from now on to park in the front where the lights were. The same week, I ended up buying some pepper spray just in case I needed it in the future. It's been about 7 years, and I still haven't used it, thank God. But I want to warn you all, even though you feel like you're safe in your own neighborhood, you still have to take precautions. Make sure that you park in well-lit areas if you're going to work very early like me. Always have a can of pepper spray or some sort of protection. You need to be aware of your surroundings, because you never know if there's someone hiding in the shadows, waiting for you to let your guard down. There are a lot of freaks roaming the streets, and you have to be careful out there, and if something doesn't feel right, follow your gut.
When I was 21, I lived with my ex-boyfriend in Southern California. It was the first time in my life that I was on my own and had the freedom of being out from under the watchful eyes of my parents, which made me a bit reckless. We lived in what was considered to be a safe neighborhood. Nice houses lined the streets. Cal State University was nearby, and we rarely heard of violent crimes happening in the area. One late Friday night in July, at approximately 1 a.m., my boyfriend and I got bored and wanted to get out of our hot apartment. We decided to walk several blocks away to a lovely park that had an artificial lake where ducks and geese would gather. There were benches around the lake where you could sit and watch the water. The sky was clear, the moon was out, and it was a hot summer night in Orange County. The park was surrounded by an expanse of towering trees and thick bushes. My boyfriend was a naturally thin guy with long hair. I was 5'5" and weighed 100 pounds at the time. We sat on a bench to watch the rippling water as the moonlight reflected off its surface, with the trees and bushes at our backs. Out of nowhere, the bright headlights of a police cruiser came speeding through the adjacent parking lot, the vehicle's frame bouncing off the concrete speed bumps as red and blue lights flashed. It then came to a screeching stop, and a spotlight was shined into the trees. We both thought, shit, we aren't supposed to be here. The hell do we do? We may or may not have been under the influence. This was remarkably bad timing. We knew the police saw us, so we just stayed because if we started running, we would risk being chased down and arrested. However, the cop didn't approach us right away. We looked on for a while and wondered, what the hell's going on over there? We thought maybe the officer caught a drug deal going down. We couldn't make out a whole lot through the trees. Eventually, the cop approached us. We thought for sure that we would get arrested or fined for being in the park while it was closed. What the officer told us was truly terrifying. He was doing a routine patrol when he spotted a man in the trees watching us. He then told us that since my boyfriend had long hair and was thin, the man hiding in the trees most likely assumed that we were both females, seeing us from behind. My boyfriend's ego was shattered. Once the cop saw that the stalker was slowly moving closer to us, that's when he decided to turn on his lights and rush in. What he found on the man was alarming. He found an arsenal of knives, handcuffs, zip ties, duct tape, and a gun. The kidnapper's field kit, basically. I was overwhelmed by fear. We were very lucky that the cop had seen him creeping around in the bushes. because it would not have ended well for us. We thanked the officer and proceeded to walk the few blocks back to our apartment in silence. I feel very lucky to be alive today, and we never returned to that park again. When I was 16, I frequently snuck out and explored abandoned buildings in my area and would do dumb teenager stuff with my two friends, Aaron and Tristan. We lived in a small town in Ireland. On this particular night, it was around 10 o'clock, and we had just finished up a 2-hour gaming session on Call of Duty. We had made plans to go explore an abandoned gas station we had recently discovered earlier that week. We arrived at the desolate gas station, which was located down an overgrown road that was so old that there wasn't even any streetlights on it. While we were walking up to the old building, Tristan saw a car sitting at the far end of the parking lot. It was an old gray Nissan. We wondered how it could have made it through the overgrown road. Tristan seemed on edge and asked if we should just go. Aaron teased him about being a little bitch, and I played along. But deep down, I felt that the car did seem a bit sketchy. We went over to inspect the old Nissan, and it appeared to be in surprisingly good condition. Looking back, that should have been our first red flag. We then made our way to the gas station. The front door and all the windows on the first and second floors were all boarded up, so we did a full 360 around the place and found out that the back door had an old cheap lock keeping it closed. Aaron picked up a discarded fence post and hit the lock until it broke. As Aaron pushed open the door, a jingling sound echoed through the store. We all jumped back in surprise, but soon realized it was just one of those bell chains that go off when a door opens. We stepped inside and began poking around. The inside of the structure was underwhelming, with random debris lying here and there, and some old shelves that were once used for inventory. We saw all there was to see on the first floor, so we made our way upstairs. It was just one large office room with chairs, desks, and a large table that sat in the center of the room. Aaron took out 3 bottles of beer from his bag, and that's when we started to loosen up and pull some chairs together. After a little bit of drinking, our laughter was cut short by what we first thought were police sirens. But then we realized it was the alarm of the Nissan parked outside. I looked through the hole in one of the boarded windows to see a large, bald man standing beside the car. I dropped my bottle on the ground in shock. The bottle smashed against the floor, and the man turned his attention to the windows. We dropped to the floor and hid under the large table and waited for what felt like an hour until the alarm stopped. That's when we all heard the bells downstairs jingling as the door creaked open. I felt like my heart was going to burst out of my chest as we heard the man say,
"I know you're here."
He then started shouting threats, saying that we made a big mistake coming here and vandalizing his car. This confused us because we didn't do anything to his car whatsoever. We then heard the man's heavy footsteps slowly coming up the stairs. From our hiding spot, I got a good look at the man as he emerged. He was a fairly large man who looked like he could easily take on the 3 of us. He started scanning the room, and I remember him saying in a disturbing voice,
Come out, wherever you are."
The man began approaching the back of the table. Aaron then did something that caught everyone off guard. He leapt out from under the table and smashed his beer bottle over the man's head, causing him to collapse upon the floor. As he toppled over, a large knife fell from his hand. We ran as fast as we could out of that place, hearing heavy footsteps coming down the stairs as we did. We ran into the surrounding forest and made our way through the trees until we got back to my house. I never felt more grateful to be alive after I got back. It's been 2 years since that night, and I still don't know what would have happened if that unhinged man caught us, and I don't think I want to know. I grew up in a decent-sized town that was about 45 minutes to an hour away from the second biggest city in the state, known for its 3 rivers and many bridges. I am the youngest of 3 boys. My mother was the general manager at my grandfather's golf course, and my father was a lieutenant for the state police at the time. We were not well off, but we were far from poor. Cop Dad was hard on us when he needed to be, but me and my brothers learned to always be respectful no matter what. Due to some family drama I'd rather not get into, I've never been super close with my brothers or my parents. Despite that, I'll admit that this situation has made me appreciate my dad more. We seem to have only one thing in common. We would protect the ones that we love at all costs, even if that meant our lives. I had gone to the downtown area to hang out with my friends at a place that was about a half a mile away from the high school's football stadium. Since we were teenagers at the time, we all rode our bikes. After a while, I realized that my bike was missing. My friends and I checked around the immediate area, and after we came up empty, I called my dad, knowing that he was home from work. He drove down to where I was. We all figured he would be pissed at us, but surprisingly he wasn't. I guess he was in a good mood that day. All my friends got on their bikes and went off in different directions towards their own homes, saying that they would keep an eye out for my bike. As my dad and I were driving back home, we saw a group of 3, 2 males and 1 female, walking down a side street towards us. One of the males was pushing my bike as they walked, causing me to snap to attention and tell my dad, "Hey, they have my bike." My dad stopped immediately and pulled over, and we jump out. I laughed inside, watching my dad go full-blown hard-ass cop on the 3 delinquents. He had the girl and one of the guys stand against the wall with their noses touching it, and he slammed the other guy with the bike to the ground. I grabbed my bike and put it in the bed of my dad's truck. Since it was only 2 of us against 3, my dad told me, "Rick, get in the truck so they don't see your face." I responded, "Fuck that," and stubbornly stood there in full view until the cops came and arrested all 3 of them, a decision I would come to regret. Fast forward about 2 years later, I was 18, and I had returned home from military school. Some of the things I learned during my time there helped me out. One night I was out jogging around 6 p.m. when a car flew past me. It then slowed down and came to a halt at a stop sign down the road. Thinking that it was odd that the car was just sitting there, watching me, I memorized the car's details as best I could as I jogged past. My house happened to be on the street. As I approached my front door, the car finally continued down the street and moved slowly past my house. I didn't really think much of this. Perhaps someone was just lost or something. Fast forward to about a week later, and I was finishing up another jog. I walked into my house through the front door, which leads directly into the kitchen. The moment I walk over to the sink by the window to splash some cold water on my face, I hear a loud bang from outside, followed by 3 others in quick succession. Thanks to my background, I knew gunfire when I heard it, and I quickly dropped down and crawled to the door, grabbing one of my brother's baseball bats before running outside. Even though I knew a bat had 0 chance against a firearm, I guess I was hoping that I would surprise them and smash the shooter in the face before he had a chance to draw down. Once I was outside, I saw a pair of taillights disappearing down the street. I recognized the vehicle from a week earlier. Thankfully, no one else besides me was home at the time. In our town, word got around fast. My brothers joked around with me, asking me smart-ass questions like, "Did you try being a hero when no one else was around?" They thought I was crazy for running outside towards gunfire with nothing but a baseball bat. It was about 2 or 3 days later when we received a call from the police. They informed us that they had caught the perpetrator. As it turns out, it was the same guy who stole my bike 2.5 years earlier. The guy had received 10 years for attempted murder with a firearm. I would later find out that he was released early. So we went on with our lives, and I became an EMT. When I was 26, I returned to my hometown to visit my parents. When I walked into the kitchen, there was a newspaper resting on a table, the front headline reading, "Local woman missing, vehicle found abandoned." As I started reading through the article, I almost immediately flipped over the kitchen table out of rage. According to the article, the missing woman's boyfriend was the same guy who had stolen my bike all those years ago and shot at my parents' house. He wasn't arrested or charged with any crime connected to the missing woman. From that day on, I always made sure I was carrying a pistol, except when I was on the job. I distanced myself from my family for a time, until I worked through some bouts of paranoia. But as they say, life goes on. I still work as an EMT to this day, and the guy who shot at my house is currently in prison on charges unrelated to the missing woman, who was found dead sometime later. Back in 2014, I joined a Facebook group that was started specifically for people who are from the town I grew up in Southern California. The whole group shared memories of the town, and everyone seemed nice, except for one person. There's always at least one asshole. This guy got on the bad side of one of the admins, whose name was Robert, and ended up being booted from the group. I'll note that I was in my mid-30s at the time, and most of the members were at least 20 years older than me. Robert was approaching 60, and was married with children who were about my age. Robert took a liking to me. Since he was married, I didn't think his friendship would go any further than that, but I was mistaken. He said that I was a down-to-earth girl and was easy to talk to. He and I exchanged phone numbers, and he would message me quite a bit. However, Robert took it a step further and found out where I lived, my landline number, and my mother's address in California. He had a subscription to one of those sites that contain information on people, their age, phone numbers, possible relatives, previous addresses, etc. He found out through Facebook when my birthday was, and he sent me flowers. I thanked him, but I started to get suspicious. His behavior was becoming alarming. He started complaining that all his wife wanted from him was his pain pills and money. Around this time, I met the man who would eventually become my husband, and of course, I announced it on Facebook. Robert went into a ballistic rage upon hearing this, saying that I should have known that he was in love with me. I told him, "You're married. Why are you in love with another woman?" He began texting me at least 10 to 20 times a day, going from calling me hateful names to profusely apologizing. I blocked his number, so he started blowing up my landline. Most of the time I kept it unplugged, so I didn't get most of the voicemails that he would leave. One day, out of curiosity, I did listen to some of the voicemails I got. In one of the messages, he claimed that I owed him $13,000. He then started making threats about how he would come to where I lived and would also pay my mother a visit. I blocked him on my landline and informed my mother about the situation. Robert got clever and started texting me from random numbers located all over California. He even sent letters to my home, and nothing he said in those letters made any sense. That's when I decided that I needed a restraining order. I tried twice through my county court, but since I lived in Washington State at the time, the judge wouldn't grant it since we lived in different states. Once Robert found out that I couldn't file a restraining order, he sent me more hateful messages and told me that I would never get rid of him. So I went back to court with the new messages. For this new hearing, Robert mailed in a letter of rebuttal. He claimed that he was a civil servant who had worked at a school district at one time and was an electrician by trade. He also said that he was on disability and couldn't drive longer for more than a half an hour without experiencing excruciating pain, and posed the question, how could he possibly come to Washington State? I told the judge that this wasn't true because he openly posted all day about his motorcycle trips to Malibu on Facebook. Regardless of the evidence, I wasn't granted a restraining order, and I felt failed by the system. I blocked him on all social media, emails, and phone numbers, but he obviously would still call using new numbers. He made a duplicate Facebook page with my profile picture and sent out friend requests to all of my friends. He had my real Facebook profile blocked, and I found out when a friend messaged me, "I got a friend request from you, but I already thought we were friends." My friend then told me that this fake profile of mine was making all kinds of posts talking shit about me. My friend reported it, and thankfully Facebook took it down. I changed my cell phone number, and I eventually moved into a new place. Things died down for a while, but Robert somehow found me on LinkedIn. After that, I straight up deleted LinkedIn and Facebook, and I saw that he even followed me on my YouTube page. I don't know how to remove someone, so I just blocked him there. To wrap up this insane story, I've included a couple of recordings of the messages he left.
Yeah, I need you to unblock me and respond to me, please. Would you consider doing that? That's the Christian thing to do, don't you think? Please, I'm not playing around. Bye. Look, if you don't respond to me, you're not leaving me too many choices here, and there only leaves me one, and I don't want to do that, and I don't want to blindside you. I wish you would just talk to me. We could work this out, but obviously you don't want that. But you're not leaving me much of choice, and I won't be going after a paycheck. Bye.
I'm a bit rusty on storytelling, but I'll do my best. My name is Caitlin. I'm a 21-year-old female, but I was 19 at the time. I had recently taken over my parents' 2-bedroom apartment in Kentucky with my 2 dogs, Kylo and Finn. I invited my boyfriend Isaac and my friend Aaron to come and live with me. They would have to share the rent, of course. The apartment wasn't in the best area. A lot of addicts roamed around at night, but it was affordable and allowed me to have my pets. To help with the story, I'll have to explain the layout of my apartment building. The building had 3 stories. The bottom was a basement level with 2 apartments and a parking garage. There were stairs that led to the 2nd story, which consisted of 4 apartments, mine being directly to the left. Beside my door was another flight of stairs that led up to the 3rd floor. I lived in one of the 2 apartments on the 2nd floor that had a yard, since they were technically on ground level. One night Isaac and I were walking the dogs, and planned on settling down and going to bed afterwards. We went around the building because my dogs were not very friendly to strangers, and someone had just pulled up out front. Kylo and Finn are both 45-pound border collies, and while they don't seem like much, their barks are deep and intimidating. I always tried to not let them scare our neighbors or their kids. Plus, I would never want them to hurt anyone. I don't think that they would, but I'm not going to take a chance on it. I love my dogs very much, but a lawsuit does not sound fun to deal with. While they were using the bathroom and I was talking with Isaac, we noticed a guy in a pink shirt leaning against the wall of the apartment across from ours. At the time, the apartment was vacant and was used for storage. Nobody lived there, and nobody ever used it at night. So seeing this guy standing there was a bit sketchy, but we paid him no mind. The man then calls out to us, "Hey!" We ignored him, since we had no idea who he was, and again, my dogs are not very friendly to strangers. Finn obviously heard this and started growling and barking, causing Kylo to do the same. So I whispered to my boyfriend, "Let's just avoid this creep and go back around front so the dogs can finish up." We continued as normal while the dogs sniffed around. Our conversation was cut short again as my dog started barking and growling. Towards the entrance of the building was the man in the pink shirt, watching us. We had walked further down into the other yards to avoid him, and there he was in front of our building. There was no telling how long he had been there, watching us. As soon as we noticed him, he left the entrance and walked through the yard and disappeared behind the building. The dogs finished up their business, and we headed for the front entrance. As soon as we got to the door, the guy in the pink shirt and some other guy with glasses were darting up the back stairwell towards us. I ushered my boyfriend and the dogs inside and slammed the door and quickly locked it as soon as they reached it. We hadn't lived in the area long, but I had gotten to know some of the other tenants in the building, as well as some of the people in the neighboring apartment building. This was so strange and out of nowhere for me. I had never seen these guys around these buildings before. Just like clockwork, there were 3 gentle, spaced-out knocks. I looked through the peephole and saw the 2 men standing outside our front door. I was definitely not going to open the door to find out what they wanted. When we didn't open up, they knocked again. Again, we refused to answer. You'd think that they would give up and just go away, but instead they proceeded to bang on our door and yell at us. "Open the fucking door!" At this point, we started freaking out, and Aaron had come out of his room and was watching the back windows, and Isaac kept an eye on the front door. After a while, the knocking and shouting died down. That's when Isaac said,
"Hey, I think they left. I don't see anyone out there now." We started to calm down, but that didn't last long. Aaron then shouted, "They're looking out our windows. I think they're trying to find a way inside." We then hear a loud thump come from one of the windows, followed by Aaron shouting, "They threw a rock at the window. What the hell is going on? Who are these guys?" There then came a loud, scratching noise at the front door. Isaac rushed to look. The man in the glasses would step out of view of the peephole and would stand right next to the door. They would continue to bang on our door demanding that we come out, all the while making that scratching sound or throwing things at our windows. None of us felt comfortable calling the cops because we were hardcore stoners with paraphernalia all over our apartment, and of course we had smoked earlier that day. So paranoia got the better of us, and it just didn't seem like a good idea to call the police. Instead, I went to the very back of my apartment, where I couldn't be heard, and called my parents. My dad is a big guy, 6'3", and built like a tank. My mom answered the phone, and once I informed her of the situation, she used my dad's phone to call my cousin. My cousin lived closer to me and also owned a gun, so he bolted over in his Jeep and parked across the street from our apartment so we could view the inside of the entryway. He confirmed that the guys were running around and hiding, going around the building and trying to find a way inside. One of them even attempted to crawl up the balcony. My mom told my cousin not to confront them, and to wait for her and my dad to show up. These guys kept this up for 40 minutes. Eventually, my cousin lost sight of them. Soon after, my parents got there and saw a group of people in a big circle beating the shit out of the guy in the pink shirt. I immediately came out of my apartment and watched as my mom got out of the car screaming, "Who the hell was knocking on my daughter's door?" Everyone scattered, and the guy in the glasses pointed at the guy in the pink, now bloodstained shirt, who was just getting off the ground. I watched as my dad walked up to him and asked him what his problem was. He then stuttered out a half-assed apology and said, I didn't mean to." My dad proceeded to ask him why he kept at it for an hour. After more mumbling, my dad picked up the guy by his shirt and flung him at least 4 feet away. I'll never forget how my dad yelled at him to get the hell away and to never come back to these apartments again. Right after this, the cops pulled up and asked us what was going on. Eventually, the cops explained that they had received a call about a group of people beating up some kid. So the call wasn't even related to the non-stop harassment that me and my roommates endured. They confirmed that something had happened at my door because of the long, deep scratch marks, which they concluded were made by a knife. I can't even imagine how the situation would have gone if we would have opened that door. It turns out that the kid had confused my boyfriend for some other guy he wanted to fight, who lived in the building next to ours. After our lease was up, we all moved away. Aaron went back to his home state, and Isaac and I moved in with my parents. About 4 months later, my mom found an article about the same guy. His name was Isaiah Harvey. He burned down a house in a nearby town. I'm so glad that we didn't open the door that night, and we didn't have our apartment burned down with my dogs inside of it. I can never thank my dad enough for getting there as fast as he did, or my cousin for coming and keeping an eye out. As a final note, seriously guys, always be aware of your surroundings. If you get a weird feeling about someone, it's best just to stay the hell away from them. This happened in the summer of 2019. I'm from Morgan Hill, California, but this story happened in the town next to mine, Gilroy. Every year, Gilroy throws a festival to attract people to the local businesses and to generate a little revenue. I used to go every year when I was a kid with my family, but the festival became more and more shady as the years went by. I was 21 at the time, and my boyfriend Will and I were going to meet up with my aunt and cousin at their booth. It was their first year as vendors, so I wanted to show my support. 3 important things to note. 1, it was my boyfriend's first time going. 2, my cousin was 8 months pregnant at the time. And 3, my cousin's first daughter had decided not to go that day, so she stayed with my uncle at his house, which was down the street from where the festival was.
We parked at my uncle's house and said our hellos before walking over. Luckily for us, we got in free because of my aunt. I noticed the security wasn't very tight, because Will walked in with his Leatherman multi-tool in his belt, and they didn't even bother checking me. After making our way through the crowd, we finally got to the tent where my family was. Maybe after 25 minutes of being there, my cousin went off to the bathroom, and Will walked off to take a look at another booth while I was still talking with my aunt. 5 minutes go by, and I hear a loud pop. Everyone around either thinks it came from the jump house 200 feet away, or a firecracker went off. For once, I listened to my instincts and made eye contact with my aunt. Within the next 30 seconds, rapid gunfire and bullets were flying through the tents, as hundreds of people were screaming and running for their lives. Like everybody else, I jumped for cover, and I saw 2 kids standing still. I threw them under me to protect them, and their mom came running over and jumped on top of me to protect all 3 of us. They eventually crawled out and hid next to a table that had been turned over. I laid flat on my stomach, watching my aunt. I heard her screaming for my cousin, and that's when I really started to panic. I had always heard that in dangerous situations, you have one of 2 responses: fight or flight. Mine was fight. I stood up and ran out of the tent, screaming for my cousin. Bullets were still flying past me, and I stayed as low as possible to make my way towards the bathrooms. However, I never made it past the tent, because Will appeared out of nowhere and yanked me by my ankle and dragged me under the table that he was hiding under. My boyfriend is a very calm and collected guy, so seeing his face turn white scared the hell out of me. I then heard a loud whistle, followed by something falling on my head. I felt my hair and discovered that a bullet casing had landed on me. During all the commotion, we somehow didn't realize that the shooter had been standing right next to us. Will and I made a break for it, and I ran so fast that I kicked my left shoe off. It's a miracle that we didn't get mowed down by this psychopath. Finally, the cops showed up and began to open fire at the shooter, causing him to take cover. My brain clicked that I needed to run. Another thing to note here is that I was a cross-country and track athlete for years, but I had to stop because of a knee injury. But in that moment, it was like my body said fuck it, and my knee snapped into place, and I ran like I was in high school again. We made it out of the park, and I immediately called my uncle. He told us to get to his house fast. As soon as I saw him outside the house, I collapsed into his arms, crying my eyes out, saying that I couldn't find my aunt or my cousin. 15 minutes later, we see my aunt and her friend who had been working the booth with her. They came around the corner, and then we hugged and cried for what felt like an hour. Neither of them had heard from my cousin, so we sat there waiting in fear. We finally got word from my cousin. She had been put onto a bus with a bunch of kids, and had been taken to a field where people parked their cars for the event. When we got there, we broke down in tears and embraced each other. She wasn't hurt, but she said the initial pop everyone heard was a misfire that landed by her feet. She said she looked up and saw the shooter reloading his gun and then taking aim into the crowd. And that's when all hell broke loose. We were in lockdown at my aunt's house for the next 6 hours. When the police finally let us go, I held Will's hand the entire ride home, asking if he was okay. He had been close to the shooter when everything went down. He ran through all the tents, flipping tables out of his way to find me. He saw a guy getting shot and collapsed on who he assumed was his girlfriend. He saw her holding him, watching as the life faded from his eyes. He still doesn't like talking about that day. I ended up with one black eye, bruised and scratched knees, and a big lump on my forehead. I think whatever higher power out there that I only suffered these minor injuries. It took 3 months, but the FBI finally interviewed me and gave me my shoe back. They told us that it took so long to get our things back because of how close we were to the chaos. After going for therapy over the next year, I feel a lot less anxious talking about it. I still jump at loud bangs, but I'm still healing. 3 lives were ended that day, and the town of Gilroy still mourns their losses. Our community is trying to rebuild itself after this incident, and with COVID happening, I think it'll be some time before the festival is brought back. I think about that day quite often, and how lucky my family was to be able to walk away unscathed. If you want to look up what happened, search Gilroy Garlic Festival Shooting 2019, and stay safe out there, everyone. I have submitted this story under a pen name to protect my identity. During the late 90s, I was at a very low point in my life. I was a drug addict, wandering the streets of downtown Los Angeles, eating out of trash cans, sleeping under bridges, and asking random bypassers for spare change. Looking back, I have nothing but regret for that time in my life. But this story is about the incident that made me sober up and turn my life around. One night I was sleeping under a secluded highway overpass. It was fairly isolated because of its location on the outskirts of the city, and saw little to no police presence. My sleeping spot overlooked a concrete foundation that stretched on for about 50 yards. It was a pretty long walk to get back to the city, but it was a price that I was willing to pay to have this place all to myself. I've had more than my fair share of close calls sleeping on Skid Row. So after a long day of panhandling, I slipped into my sleeping bag and began to doze off. I was suddenly woken up by the sounds of screaming. I turned to my side to see a car parked under the overpass, but the vehicle's windows were down. I could tell that there was commotion taking place inside the cab. Now I know what you might be thinking. At first, I thought the same thing too. Maybe someone was getting lucky. But these were not screams of pleasure. They were screams of agony. A chain-link fence bordered the concrete platform beneath the overpass, and at night, a white light next to the fence would turn on and partially illuminated the area. It wasn't the best lighting, but you could still see the area from my sleeping spot. I watched in horror as the passenger side door of the car flung open, and a skimpily dressed woman exited the vehicle. She was holding her leg, trying her best to limp away from the car. I was frozen in place, almost not believing what I was witnessing. The girl was begging for her life as she awkwardly staggered away from the vehicle. The driver's side door then opened, and a figure emerged from the car. I couldn't quite make out the details of this person because the passenger side of the car was facing me. The person then pointed a gun at the girl and shot her. I remember closing my eyes as the gun went off and opening them to see the woman sprawled out on the ground. She was on her back, and the way her head was positioned was as if she was looking at me. Her jaw was going up and down like she was trying to say something. The memory of seeing her like that still haunts me. The shooter made his way over to her, and when he stepped into the light, I could see that he was wearing a dark hooded jacket with a bandana hiding his face. He stood over her and just watched her for several seconds before finishing her off with a second shot. I was absolutely petrified at what I had just witnessed. I was now sitting up on my sleeping bag with one hand over my mouth, trying my best not to make a sound. But what happened next was a whole new level of fucked up. The headlights of another vehicle at the opposite end of the overpass flicked on and drove up to the gruesome scene. At first I was relieved and stupidly thought that these people were here to help, not even factoring in that a bystander wouldn't just casually drive up to a scene of a crime with the killer still there with a loaded gun. I guess after I witnessed something so horrible, the logical part of my brain wasn't working too well. But things became clear to me once I noticed that the other vehicle was a black van, and things became even more clear once I saw 3 men wearing ski masks exiting the van, one of them holding a video camera. These sick fucks were filming this entire thing? There was an exchange of words, and the other 2 men that exited the van walked over to the dead woman and grabbed her arms and legs, then proceeded to carry her body back to the car. The shooter had made his way over to the car before they got there, and the cameraman stayed off to the side and filmed the entire thing. The shooter popped open the trunk, and the men heaved the corpse into it. Without going into too much detail, I'll add that the men did not seem to be concerned at all about the blood.
The cameraman then joined them at the car for a nice close-up shot. The shooter then walked over to the van and returned with 2 cans of gas. The men doused the car in gasoline, and the shooter struck a match and threw it, and the car was instantly engulfed in flames. The 4 men and myself watched as the car burned. As I stared into the fire, I became numb. I had apparently reached my scare limit, and now I was just angry. Angry at these animals for what they had done. Even if this woman was an addict or a hooker, no one deserves to die like that, murdered under an overpass in cold blood. The fact that they were filming this whole thing pissed me off even more. I considered this to be the exact moment I stopped being a drug addict. The 4 men eventually piled back into the van and left. A short while later, I emerged from the overpass and made my way over to the nearest payphone to call the police. I don't think the police took me seriously at first, until I led them to the burning car. I was questioned for hours by detectives, and yes, they did suspect me, a homeless junkie, of foul play. But I stuck to my story. They did keep me in a holding cell for a few days, which they probably couldn't legally do, but I honestly didn't mind at all. Free showers and food. I was actually a bit bummed out when they eventually released me. I later found out that there were similar killings in San Francisco and Sacramento, and that the perpetrators were wanted by the FBI. I don't know for sure if they ever caught them. I can only hope that they did. After that night, I decided I had enough of living on the streets. The fear I experienced inspired me to get my shit together, finish college, and become an English teacher. I'm proud to say that I've been sober for almost 23 years. Sometimes seeing the ugliest side of humanity is the cure.
There's always a reason to be afraid.
I used to live with my dad in Georgia in a somewhat isolated area. For reference, I'm a female, and I was 13 at the time. My dad owned 5 acres of land, and a bunch of our relatives lived on the same property. There was a long driveway that branched off into separate mud and gravel driveways. Normally during the weeknights, I would finish my homework, and then decide if I wanted to listen to my stereo or watch some paranormal shows. On the night in question, I would say it was around 9 p.m. I was getting settled down for the night, when suddenly, out of nowhere, there came a tap on my bedroom window. My bedroom was on the 2nd floor, and there were no trees near my window for someone to climb up. Most of my family were away at the time, so right away, I was a bit freaked out. There was a large TV stand in front of the window, which obscured my view. I went downstairs and searched through the kitchen and the living room to see if anyone was outside. My dad usually worked late nights, so I was unfortunately home alone at the time. I thought maybe my dad had forgotten his house keys, and I started walking towards the front door to check if he was there. I couldn't see his car in the driveway, since he usually parks by the front door window. Directly behind the living room is a sliding glass door with long blinds. The light on the back porch was on, and I could see a silhouette of someone standing on my back porch. Panic took over. I knew that it wasn't my father, and I didn't know if the door was locked. If I just stood there, I would give the intruder the chance to enter the house, so I bolted to the door to make sure it was locked. I stuck my hands through the blinds, too afraid to look outside. Thankfully, it was locked. I then ran to the kitchen and grabbed a huge knife to protect myself, and then went back upstairs into my bedroom. Right as I turned my light off, there came a loud bang outside my window. I hid in my closet and called my dad to let him know what was going on. He confirmed that no one should be at the house and said that he was heading over right away before he hung up. I called the cops, and the dispatch informed me that the nearest unit was about 25 minutes away. I waited in the closet with a knife ready to strike at whoever entered my room. The banging noises continued, and they sounded as if they were coming from every direction, almost as if there was more than one lunatic outside trying to get in. My dad and the police got there at the same time, but by then, the assailants were gone. The officers conducted a quick search of the property before taking my statement. My dad told me afterward that they saw multiple sets of footprints in the mud going all the way around the house. I'm not sure what was scarier, seeing the figure on the back porch, or knowing that there was multiple people there. Nothing ever came of it, and to this day, I still have no clue why they were there. This happened to me when I was going to school in Los Angeles during the spring of 2012. I grew up in Indiana in a very safe community, so it took a while for me to adjust to the craziness and crime in the city. I was living in an apartment with 4 other women at my college. Our place was above a house, so to access it you had to go down a long alleyway next to the house and up some stairs, so it was pretty out of the way. On this particular day, I stopped by the apartment to grab some music before a choir practice, so I came inside and started gathering my materials on the kitchen table. I didn't bother locking the door since I would only be there for a few minutes. There was a knock on the screen door, and when I looked up, there was a man standing on the doorstep. He was a young Hispanic male, medium height, and wearing a t-shirt and jeans. Hello? I called out to him, thinking that he was delivering a package or something. The man doesn't say a word and reaches down and opens the screen door. He then begins to walk towards me. Still at this point, I was not alarmed, starting to say something about him leaving the package on the table, when I noticed he didn't have one. The only thing in his hand was a box cutter. By the time I realized this, he was too close for me to escape, and he put the blade against my neck. He then told me to get up and walk into my roommate's bedroom next to the kitchen. He locks the door and pushes me onto the bed. My mind is racing the whole time, telling myself that he probably just wants to rob me and that I will let him take whatever he wants. As I'm sitting on the bed, he starts looking around the room. He then grabs some telephone cables next to the bed and begins trying to tie my wrists together. It wasn't working too well, but he kept trying. I eventually snapped out of my trance, realizing that this situation could become even more dangerous if he binds me. I screamed and started pushing him. I made a break for the door. He caught me and tried again to tie my hands together, but I was thrashing and screaming and kept hitting him in his head. After a few seconds of this, he decides to bail and runs out of the apartment. I followed him, screaming for help. One of my neighbors who lived in the house under our apartment came out within seconds and saw the guy running down the alley and chased him into the street. We called the cops, and they came right away. I ended up going down to the station, where I worked with a police sketch artist on a composite that ended up being posted on the television. They caught the guy within a week. The police officer who responded to the scene said that there was a local gang that required new members to cut off the nipples of women and bring them back as an offering. Ever since this experience, I always tell people to lock their doors, even if they're just stopping by to grab a few things. You're better off safe than sorry. In 1987, I was 12 years old. I grew up in a third world country in Africa. I remember that outside of my village, there were these massive rock formations that me and my friends would often play in. One of our favorite games was hide and seek. One day all the children got together and planned on having the biggest hide and seek game we had ever played. Myself and 2 others were selected as the seekers, and we would count to 50 in an alley behind the marketplace and then look for the hiders in the rocks. After about 15 minutes of searching, we didn't find anyone. We were confused because it was an unspoken rule that you could only hide in the rock formations. So we decided to look through the marketplace and the rest of the village. Still, nothing. When one of us noticed something in the distance. For some context, beyond the cluster of rocks was a desert that expanded for miles. There were these unmoving figures on the horizon. The best way to describe them is that they looked like scarecrows. Small scarecrows hoisted onto pikes sticking out of the ground. We ran back to our village screaming. Everything else is a blur to me. I only remember certain parts. Chaos broke out in the village. Our huts were burned to the ground, and my father threw me onto a truck before he was gunned down in front of me. Nearly everyone I knew died that day. My name is Samuel O'Brien, and I am originally from Somalia. What happened to my people is often referred to as the Isaac Genocide. This happened on Halloween night in 2019. Me and 3 of my friends, Dennis, Eddie, and Adam, were out doing what most 14-year-olds would do on Halloween: get as much candy as possible. Afterward, we hung out at the bowling alley and played a few games there. I was the one in the group who stuck out like a sore thumb. Eddie and Adam were dressed in all black, donning skeleton masks, and Dennis was wearing a latex Michael Jackson mask. However, I was wearing a bright red and black Spider-Man costume. This will be important later on, so just keep it in mind. After we bowled a few games, we decided to go to another nearby neighborhood to prank a couple of people we knew. Not anything dangerous, we would just knock on their door and scare them. However, when we approached the first house, this is where things took a turn for the worst. We rang the doorbell and waited for an answer. All of my friends were in the front yard, waiting to jump out. I was crouched below the fence by the pathway that led to the street. A car then pulls up across from me, with its windows down. I noticed 2 men in the vehicle. One was a skinny guy, and the other was much larger and more intimidating. Not wanting to give off the impression that I was up to no good, I gave them a friendly smile and waved to them before putting my mask on. Moments later, nobody answered the door, and the car was still idling across the road, so we decided to go elsewhere. We made our way further up the street and noticed that the car started moving again, keeping pace with us but maintaining its distance. At this point, Dennis, Eddie, and Adam had caught on to the fact that something was wrong. So we turned into a dark alley that went uphill. There was no lighting, so it was pitch black. About halfway up, we looked behind us to see if we were still being followed. What we saw sent a sharp feeling of dread up my spine. The larger man was marching up the alley. We took off down the alley and made it to the other side and started down the hill and into another neighborhood to avoid the men. This is where I realized that the shoes that I had on were awful. It was basically just a rubber sole with nothing on the inside that would secure my foot in place, so it would slip out of the shoe with every step, making running impossible. We tried everything. I even tried to piggyback off of one of my friends, which proved useless despite me being the skinniest, so I had no choice but to hop my way down the street. Meanwhile, the large man had reached the end of the alley. He crossed the street and waited. Soon, the car came around the corner and pulled up, and he got in. We were just about to turn the corner when the car came speeding onto the path in front of us, nearly running me over. This is where I decided to stay where I was with my hands raised above my head. The others took off without me. I don't blame them. It was a fight or flight situation. I pretty much accepted that I was likely going to be murdered. The large man then got out of the car and started yelling, "Get your fucking friends back here now!" The skinny guy still in the car had already caught up with them. They eventually let us go. It turns out that they thought we were a different group of kids that apparently were throwing eggs at their car. Me and my friends retreated back to the bowling alley and called our parents to come pick us up. That was enough for tonight. We were thoroughly terrified about being hunted down by a couple of creepy-ass guys. While we were waiting for them, we saw that same car pass us again, 3 more times. And even after me, Dennis, and Adam left, Eddie called us to say that he saw it pass 1 more time. Something that still bothers me about this whole situation is that I want to know how they could have mistaken us for another group of kids.
I was wearing bright red spandex for crying out loud. I doubt whoever they were pursuing that night was wearing something similar. Also, the fact that they circled us after the encounter makes me question what they were really up to. I believe that we all narrowly escaped a gruesome fate on that Halloween night. Me and a friend of mine who I'll call Josh and a couple of our friends went to a Halloween party on October 30th of 2018. We all decided to go as characters from the Purge movies. We all had on these smiling LED masks. Josh's was the only mask that had a green light. This will come into play later. There were 5 of us, and we all indulged in alcohol. Josh got so wasted that he couldn't even stand up. It was around 2 o'clock in the morning when we decided to call it quits. Since I had the car, and was the only one out of the group who didn't drink as much as the others, it fell to me to drive everyone else home. I had to walk Josh to his front door, because he fell on his ass as soon as he got out of the car. After he got inside and closed the door, I dropped the rest of my friends off and then went home. It was around 5 a.m. when I woke up to my phone ringing. I looked at my phone to see that it was Josh calling me. I rubbed the sleep from my eyes and answered. Hello?
Hey, I think there's someone in my house.
Josh's voice was extremely hushed and panicked. My heart dropped. He went on to say that he heard footsteps in his living room and got up to see what it was. He then heard someone rush out of the side door. He said he was now hiding behind his bed with the door to his room locked. I couldn't believe my ears. Josh lived in a pretty big house in a safe neighborhood. I never thought anyone would have the balls to break in. You need to call the cops, I told him. That should have been his first call, but remember, he was still heavily intoxicated. He called the police from his house phone, and I stayed on the line with him until they showed up. The cops found footprints on his carpet and his side door wide open. He was so drunk that he must have forgotten to lock it. Of course, there was no sign of the intruder anywhere. The cops then told Josh to lock all of his doors and call back if anything else happened. It was now Halloween. I went over to Josh's house to help him pass out candy to the children. It was around 9 p.m. when the parents started telling their kids to come inside, mostly because it was a school night. We were packing everything up when we heard a tap on the window. The blinds were closed, and we could see a green light coming from the other side. I slowly approached the window and opened the blinds. What I saw terrified me. Standing on the other side was a man brandishing a knife, but most disturbing of all, he was wearing the same LED purge mask that Josh had on the night before. The man let out a horrifying laugh before he started banging on the window like a lunatic. We just stood there in total shock. Eventually, we ran out of the room and grabbed the phone to call 911. We then heard someone screaming from outside. I'm guessing some passersby saw the man at the window and got startled. The man then took off. When the cops got there, the only description that they could give was that he was wearing a green light-up purge mask. As far as I know, the guy was never caught. The moral of the story is that you should make sure your doors are locked at night. Halloween sometimes brings out the crazies. This happened on Halloween night a few years back. It was a chilling 60 degrees out that night, but it was still nice enough to have the windows cracked while cruising down the road. Me and my girlfriend, who is now my wife, wanted to do something scary to get ourselves into the Halloween spirit. So after doing some research online, we discovered an abandoned Girl Scout camp on the outskirts of town. It closed down due to a fire that resulted in the death of a young girl back in 1975. Her spirit supposedly can be seen wandering through the nearby forest after midnight. At around 11:30 we packed up and headed out. I knew that homeless people sometimes like to camp in the cement structures to get out of the weather, so I made sure to bring my metal baseball bat.
There were 8 of us. Myself, my girlfriend, and 6 of our friends. We drove 3 separate cars there. On the way there, I noticed a white cargo van parked under a bridge next to a lake, but I didn't think anything of it at the time. We eventually turned down the secluded road that led to the forest trail. We parked, exited our vehicles, and pulled out our flashlights, then headed down the path towards the old ruined building. After 30 to 45 minutes of just messing around, pretending to scare each other in the dark, we suddenly heard the crunching of leaves. We all stopped in our tracks and listened. We then heard my girlfriend's car horn sound off in the distance. It then occurred to me that I had left her windows cracked, and someone was now reaching into the car and activating the horn. After the initial shock, we all began sprinting back. Wielding the bat, me and another one of my friends took point and cautiously approached the area where the cars were parked. I saw a shadow duck behind one of the cars, and then told my friend to shine his flashlight towards that spot, and we approached the car, but saw nothing. We quickly checked the rest of the area, but nothing was around the vehicles or inside them. We then heard the sound of tires skidding to a halt, and saw the white van blocking the only exit. 2 of my friends sprinted to their car as a man stepped out and approached us. Something about him felt off. I noticed that his right hand was buried into his jacket pocket.
Do any of you have a lighter?
The man asked, his hand never leaving his pocket. And I suddenly felt vulnerable. Alarm bells were going off in my head. What good would this bat do if this guy had a gun? We slowly backed away to the car, quickly locking ourselves inside.
Why are you leaving? We're not cops.
The pale moonlight illuminated the man's sickly smile as he stood between the cars.
Which one of you fuckers has a light?
Just then, my friend started up his car, causing the man to look in his direction. I took this as my cue to fire up my girlfriend's car. We then hauled ass out of there. It turns out that there was just enough room for our vehicles to make it past the van. We sped down that country road as fast as we could and made it back to my place in record time. I have no idea what that man had planned for us, or what he had in his pocket, but it couldn't have been good. If you're going to have an adventure on Halloween night, just remember to be careful and pay close attention to your surroundings, especially when you're doing something potentially dangerous. You may just get more than what you bargained for. I'm submitting this story on behalf of a friend of mine who experienced this terrifying and traumatic event. I will relay the story from his perspective. To provide some background, I'm a 21-year-old guy living in what I call medical housing. Basically, in this small village, you're either an elderly person or have severe health problems like I do, but can still be somewhat self-sufficient. Each resident has their own cottage, 1 bedroom or 2 bedrooms. Mine was the former. The incident took place 2 weeks ago. While I was at social hour with a few of my fellow residents, they mentioned hearing some strange knocks on their doors and windows at night. One resident even claimed that someone tried to twist their doorknob. Luckily, she had the door locked. Since we weren't too far from another neighborhood, everyone assumed a couple of kids were causing trouble. Our village didn't exactly have or need much security, or so we thought. Fast forward a few days later. I had my regular physical therapy. I must have forgotten to lock one of my doors. Even during the pandemic, we're a tight-knit community, so if a stranger tried to sneak in, someone would notice. When I got home, I was exhausted, and I took a long nap. I woke up to my neighbor from across the street, Vicky, entering the cottage to help me set up my feeding machine and breathing apparatus for the night. She's a sweet, motherly woman who used to be a nurse. During her visit, she went over to the furnace to turn it on, but didn't twist the dial much. "That's strange. Your heat's not working. It's going to be cold tonight, and you need to stay warm. Why don't you come stay with me until maintenance fixes your furnace tomorrow morning?" I was still quite groggy from my nap, so I didn't think twice about what she said, until I saw the look on her face. We both have a background in theater, so I could tell when she was acting. Despite being nervous and puzzled, I just went along with it. All of my necessary medical supplies and equipment were gathered and ready to be packed up. Vicky worked quickly to help me and supported me as I walked to the front door. She seemed to be walking a little too fast, but I was too tired to say anything. While we were doing that, I heard a strange noise from my walk-in closet. I didn't think much of it and figured it was my cat using his litter box or playing with his toy. When we entered her cottage, her husband Frank set up the extra bed, and that's when she revealed the truth to me. While Vicky was grabbing an IV from the cabinet next to the closet, she caught a glimpse of something. There was a dark figure crouching in the closet. She didn't want to startle me as I could have stopped breathing because of my condition. I felt nauseous. For all I knew, that person could have been there the entire time I was at physical therapy, or during my nap. Vicky, realizing that I was disturbed, hugged me and said, "Don't be scared. Frank and I will be in the bedroom. If anything happens, call out. Frank's got a gun, and we won't let anything happen to you." I was too exhausted and disoriented to inquire about someone calling the police. I just assumed she would take care of that. But the story does not end there. Later, I woke up to the sound of tapping on the bedroom window. Lo and behold, there was a man standing there. I'm not sure how tall he was, but I'd say he probably was around 6 feet if I had to guess. "I see you in there. I'm coming in, one way or another." I was hooked into the treatment machines, immobile, helpless, and absolutely terrified. Immediately, I was yelling for Vicky and Frank. "Get your gun now!" I heard Vicky yell. Frank was a retired police officer and can still be pretty intimidating. As they rushed in, Frank pointed his gun at the window where the man was still lurking. "Get off my property or I'll blow your brains out, you nutcase!" he yelled. Vicky helped me get up, and we both entered the master bedroom, where she locked the door behind her and pulled me into the walk-in closet. At this point, even while hooked to the oxygen supply, my breathing became irregular. Fortunately, Vicky was able to console me and regulate my breathing before I passed out. A few minutes later, Frank knocked on the bedroom door. After Vicky let him in, she called the police. The guy wasn't just tapping on the window now, he was practically banging it down. Vicky immediately called the cops. Since they frequently passed by our village, it didn't take long for them to get there. When the police arrived, they found cracks on the spare bedroom window where the intruder had been pounding on it. However, the man had disappeared by the time they got there. I was terribly shaken up and still having trouble breathing. There was no way I would be sleeping in that spare bedroom now. That night, Vicky stayed with me in the master bedroom, providing comfort and assurance until I fell asleep. The police contacted the medical housing staff the following day regarding what happened. Since then, security guards have been hired around the clock. They are also working on enough money to build a gate and essentially turn this establishment into a gated community. A few days after the incident, Frank installed security cameras and alarms in my cottage and in his. This is an unexplained event that my dogs and I have experienced multiple times. For some context, I live in a very isolated part of the Midwest, meaning that not a lot happens around here besides farming or the occasional small-town drama. To my knowledge, there have been no killings, witchcraft, or anything to provoke a strange event. Following this experience, I have researched for years, and I still have not come up with an explanation, so here it goes. A few years ago, my dog and I were in our back garden. I was picking some cucumbers and pulling weeds. We live by a forest that I usually love to go hike in whenever the weather permits me. As we were leaving the garden, I heard a strange sound coming from within the woods. It sounded like an animal at first, but as I got closer, I realized that my dog was extremely on edge, ears perked up, showing her fangs. She has never done this before and has always been an extremely passive dog. As we walked closer to the forest, we heard what sounded like heavy, labored breathing. It was exaggerated, like someone was trying to pull a prank on me. I walked down the path for about 20 feet into the woods, and the noise surrounded me. There was no distinguishable point of origin, not above, nor to my left or right. It was as if this raspy, exaggerated breathing was inside my head. My dog had her tail tucked between her legs and was looking extremely nervous, so we booked it out of there. As we left, I could still hear the breathing until we got back inside. The rest of that night was uneventful. Fast forward to almost a year ago. My dog from the previous incident had passed away, and I currently own a new dog. I had completely forgotten about the incident, until the day that I was metal detecting around our property for some screws I dropped. As we made our way through the trees, my dog stopped and looked in the exact same spot that my other dog did a few years back. It was daylight, so we would have easily seen any large animals. Out of pure curiosity, I ended up metal detecting around the area to see if anything was there. What I found was confusing. There were these strange pieces of iron buried next to each other about a half-foot into the soil. Next to them, I found 3 of my small model paint jars that I had thrown out the previous week. This was alarming, given that we do not have any raccoon problems around here, and we have security cameras on our property, meaning that if someone was digging around in our bin, we would have been immediately notified. I remember bagging the paint jars before, so there's no way they would have slipped out of the waste bin and ended up all the way out here. This made me feel as if I was being targeted by something. I still have no answers, but something tells me that the heavy breathing I heard outside of my house a few years back is connected somehow. So, what do you think? I would describe myself as a loner during my high school years. I would often play video games, keep to myself, and not socialize with anyone outside of a few friends. One day, my friend, who I'll call Charlie, told me that he was having a sleepover at his house on Friday, and I agreed to join. When Friday came, my parents drove me to his house. Charlie and I headed straight to his basement and played some Call of Duty until around 11, when his mom told us it was time for bed. I woke up at around 2 a.m. to hear a thud above me, as if someone was stomping on the floor above us. I tried to wake up Charlie, but his subconscious told me to fuck off. I tried to go back to sleep, but I heard another loud thud above me about a half hour later, followed by heavy footsteps. I heard the basement door slowly creak open. I decided to hide in the closet, behind some coat hangers. After a while of waiting, I ended up dozing off. I would say I woke up around an hour later, to the sound of heavy breathing. I looked up, and what I saw next sent chills rushing down my body. Through the slits in the closet door, a pair of eyes were peering in at me. My stomach felt as if it was about to explode. I covered my mouth with both hands to stop myself from screaming. I went further back into the closet and hid in the darkness, and stayed there until the morning. I didn't mention anything to Charlie or his mother about what I saw. To this day, I don't know who or what came down into the basement and just stared at me through the closet door. It gives me the creeps just thinking about it. After that night, I stopped going to Charlie's house. Please forgive any grammatical errors in the story. English is my fourth language. For some context, I'm from a small town in Lithuania, only a few kilometers away from the Kaliningrad Oblast border. My country has its share of pagan folklore. Stories of ghosts and witches have been told on these lands for centuries. But this story is about a local urban legend exclusive to my hometown, and my personal experience with it. The story of the Jingling Man was more or less used to scare small children into behaving when I was growing up. Although this story has been embellished over the years, it is based on an actual double murder that took place back in 1979. You most likely won't be able to verify any of this, because my country was under the control of the Soviet Union until 1990, and the government didn't keep the best records of homicides that took place within its borders during those times. First off, I have to mention that our town has a medieval-themed festival that takes place every year. People from all over Europe come here in the fall to attend the festival. It's really the only interesting thing about our little town. The festival was established in the late 70s, during the Soviet era, and has been run by the same family for over 40 years. Back in '79, there was a man named Lucas Popov, who worked at the attraction as a performer. Lucas used to be a stage actor in Moscow when he was younger, and his talents were used to portray many characters for the annual festival. To this day, you can see him in several pictures and the historical exhibition displays of the festival. One character that Lucas was known for was the village fool. He would wear a pair of black leather boots laced with several tiny bells that jingled every time he walked. Whenever the other characters would hear him approaching, they would jokingly say, "Oh, I hear the bells. Here comes the village idiot." It was a thing they did for the children. So the story goes that after a long day of working at the festival, Lucas returned home to find his wife in bed with another man. His rage overtook him, and he savagely beat them both to death with a wooden rolling pin. Nobody knows what happened to him after the murders. Some say he was arrested and executed by the Soviet authorities. Others say that he hung himself after he committed the crime. Whatever the case, Lucas was never seen again. Not long after his disappearance, hikers began telling strange stories about hearing a jingling sound in the forest during their travels. Many of the older people from my town claim that they could hear the stomping of boots outside their homes in the dead of night, always accompanied by the chimes of several tiny bells. They would say it was the vengeful spirit of Lucas. If anyone were to see him, he would mistake them for either his wife or her lover, and would brutally beat them to death. I know this all might sound a little far-fetched, and maybe even slightly ridiculous, but this story used to terrify us as kids. The multiple unsolved disappearances in the surrounding area gave further credence to this legend. I remember that whenever me and my friends would have a sleepover, we would spend the nights looking out our bedroom windows, pointing flashlights at anything that moved, seeing if we could spot the Jingling Man. Eventually, my country would gain its independence in 1990, and the legend of the Jingling Man dissolved along with the USSR. So now that I've given you the background, let's get into my personal experience. In 2011, I returned to my hometown from college and planned on spending a couple of weeks with my aging parents. The night after I came back, I met up with some of my old friends and had a couple of beers at a local pub. The friends that I came there with lived in the next building over, and by the time midnight rolled around, they were all pretty hammered. I was still well above my limit, so after I helped my buds back into their apartment, I decided to walk back to my parents' house. It was a beautiful night out, and I had a lot on my mind. I wanted to walk so I could clear my head. To give you a good mental image, I've included a picture of a street in Vilnius, our capital. The streets in my town are nearly identical. It's all very gridlocked. During the nights, it becomes a ghost town. You'll see the local police doing their nightly patrols from time to time, but otherwise, the streets are empty. Most of the town's population lived in townhouses and apartments, but my parents lived in one of the last houses outside the settlement. They lived in the forest, but it was only about a 20-minute walk from the pub. I made it to the end of the street and went through the trees until I made it to the dirt road that my parents lived off of. I was about halfway there, and there was absolutely no light whatsoever. It's a good thing that I knew the way by heart, and there was just enough moonlight so that I could see where I was going. So, there I was, making my way through the dark woods in the dead of night, with nothing but my thoughts to keep me company. After 5 minutes of walking, I heard a noise behind me that sent goosebumps down my arms. It was the sound of several tiny bells jingling. I turned to see a dark figure moving among the trees, one jingling step at a time. I instantly remembered the stories from my childhood. "Who's there?" I shouted angrily, thinking that someone was messing with me. The figure stopped in its tracks and then slowly moved out of the trees, making its way to the middle of the road. The silhouette appeared to be wearing a large overcoat. As it stood in the moonlight, it reached into its person and pulled out a large object that looked like a baseball bat. A deep voice echoed from the figure, speaking in Russian.
You think I don't know?
As it spoke, it sent chills through my entire body. The figure raised the object over its head, as if it was about to attack.
You think I don't know what you two've been doing behind my back? You think I don't know?
The voice grew louder, practically screaming at me. I took a step back in shock. If this was some kind of joke, whoever this was an award-winning actor, because I could feel a genuine rage from their words, and it thoroughly terrified me. I decided that I should run, so I quickly turned back around and made a break for it. I ran down the dark path, hearing heavy footfall behind me, each stomp accompanied by the horrifying jingling sound. They pursued me all the way back to my parents' house. When I finally reached the entrance, the jingling stopped. Then I finally looked behind me. All I saw was an empty forest, bathed in moonlight. As I closed the gate behind me and walked up to the front door, I heard the jingling sound once more. As I looked behind me one last time, the hairs on my arms stood up as I saw the dark figure slowly walking back down the road towards the forest. It then vanished into the shadows of the night. I have no clue if this was someone trying to frighten me, or if I experienced a paranormal event. Whatever the case, it scared the shit out of me. So, if you ever visit Lithuania and decide to go for a stroll in the woods after dark, and you hear the sound of several tiny bells jingling from the darkness, it's probably not Santa's little helper, and you should run your ass off.